over the course of my career, I had the opportunity to see literally all facets of an organization and a company. I've seen entry-level positions and the pressures that entry-level roles are under. I've been in team leader positions, head of department positions, director positions for global organizations, have been leading leadership teams, hiring and building them, so where I would lead other leaders. I've seen many different industries, including the nonprofit sector, and four different major geographies from North America to South America and Europe and the Middle East. And I think what stuck for me from all of those experiences is there are certain principles that are true everywhere. And there are certain conditions of human psychology and of humans who work in organizations that are true everywhere. And what are those, and why does this even matter? Now, if you want to be effective leaders, we are always dealing with people. We're always dealing with people's emotions. We're dealing with expectations, sometimes explicit, sometimes implicit. We are under immense pressure ourselves, and we sometimes look for guidance, we cannot find it. But most of the time, all of this creates a tunnel vision for us where we ultimately get stuck in a very narrow tunnel. And that narrow tunnel is us being stuck in the day-to-day, in reactive firefighting, in solving problems as they pop up. And we are always on the defense. And this happens by default in organizations. Now, exceptions, right? There are certainly organizations that feel more like lounge cafes than actual companies. But for most companies who actually are ambitious and who are driven and are working in fast-paced environments, fast-paced markets, and who have ambitious goals, you will definitely see there's a lot of pressure. And this pressure creates narrow visions. And typically an organization always leads to the same thing. Leaders, and regardless of the level that they're on, try to solve their own issues, try to look good to their superiors. They don't want to draw negative attention on them. So often information or like crucial risks, even systemic risks of the company and the market are not getting to the leader, are not getting to the tops. They're not even being addressed sometimes in executive meetings because nobody wants to be the black sheep who brings the bad news. Too often the messenger is shot instead of the problem actually being solved. And again, this is regardless of industries and geographies. Like you can literally see this everywhere. It's just a human condition in hierarchies and social organization. And so what happens is that that we just end up in a constant state in organizations of doing and doing and busyness, and it sometimes doesn't take an end. And we get into cycles of diminishing returns where we just maintain something, we keep it going, we keep it running, and our roles move into being maintainers of a status quo. And once we have achieved this level, then the maintenance of the status quo requires us to basically ignore and shut out any form of innovation, any form of dissent. Like if our employees or our leaders or anyone has different opinions, different views, we need to keep things stable and we keep them the way they are. We worship the status quo. And in volatile and uncertain, ambiguous, and complex environments, that gives us an illusion of control, an illusion of safety. But the problem with all of this is that organizations are living organisms. They're ecosystems. It's very helpful to see it that way. Organizations are not just org charts that you can put on a whiteboard. They are living organisms. It's organizational resources, humans mostly interacting with each other and interacting with the market, interacting with stakeholders, interacting with rules, with regulations, with norms, with agreements, with contracts. And if you really want to break it down, it's a world of agreements between humans. The employee signs a contract that from this day onwards, they will call the other individual their CEO or their team leader. And in return, that contract says that they get a financial compensation every single month or every 2 weeks. And so that means that there's nothing but an agreement. In a nutshell, organizations are complex webs of agreements. And that also makes them fluid to a certain degree in theory, but in practice, often these agreements become so crystallized, they become so stagnant that we don't even question them anymore. We cannot imagine an alternative. And the more an organization matures, the more it becomes stagnant, the more it becomes crystallized. Now, that will all be fine if we would be building a house. We want it to be stable, but organizations are not only dynamic internally, they also interact with dynamic environments. Regulations change. New technologies enter the market, the industry. New competitors pop up. There's new consumer preferences. Maybe the top talent has new preferences for their employers, and you cannot get the same quality of people anymore unless you make changes. The environment always changes. Right? There could be turmoil, there could be geopolitical risks, there could be economic downturns. There are a lot of things that happen that are dynamic that you cannot that do not fit on a spreadsheet, that do not fit into a boxed-in container. Right? We talk about the illusion of safety, the illusion of control. So the external environment is inherently volatile, inherently uncertain, unstable. We use processes, systems, and so forth to create a certain level of stability of our internal operations and also of the way of how we interact with the external environment. So that gives us, again, the illusion of control. But also those are nothing but agreements. And the problem is the moment an organization gets stuck in its processes and its systems and its way of doing things in the status quo, that it almost becomes a dogma, a doctrine that cannot be challenged. And while it's certainly wise to have operating principles, an operating thesis that doesn't change, or change really hardly, if that same level of dogmatism or of unwillingness to change happens at the branches of the organization, so in every single process, in every single interaction, in everything that's happening actually on the front lines of the organization, if it all becomes a rigid command and control, micromanagement, rigid protocols, then the organization will ultimately break on the branches, on the external parts first, and that will move further and further into the core and ultimately collapse the organization because it cannot react in real time to what's going on. I've been obsessed with studying VUCA environment, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous environments, which you can find anywhere in natural disaster zones, in conflict zones, in high and fast-growing markets, in economic downturns, whenever an organization deals with great uncertainty. And I would argue that uncertainty is the new normal anyway. And this requires one particular thing, or that forces one particular thing on organizations, which is the loss of the status quo, the loss of the comfortable illusion of safety, that if I can just keep things in my narrow little tunnel, if I can keep things under control, if I keep every other external input out of my world and ignore it, I can keep my illusion of safety, I can keep a certain level of stability. The problem with this is it certainly works in the short term, but it will then further down the line force you into reactivity. The situation will then force you, and you will be in a very disempowered posture. So especially dealing with uncertain environments, you want to get ahead of the change. You want to be proactive. You want to position yourself before bad things happen. And how do you do this? It goes really back to a commitment to the what and the why, to the purpose of the organization, and a great flexibility in the how. And the how is not just what sales method is my salesperson using now, are they allowed to give a discount or not? The how is also how do we lead? The how is how do we need to restructure our organization as it moves through different market environments. In startups and scale-ups, it's also often about funding rounds. After doing seed stage, for example, I might have a lot of camaraderie with a few people, and then once I hit my Series A, now I'm required to show that I can sell at volume, And now I need to hire all kinds of people. My organization will change. It needs to change. And in order to hit Series B, I need to show that I can sell at volume, but also efficiently, right? Of course, exceptions aside. But most of the time, that's the lifetime. That's the life cycle of the startup to hit Series B efficiently. Now I need to build entirely different structures again, right? And pivot and reorganize. And so the how of how we structure the organization in order to achieve certain goals, in order to achieve certain desired outcomes, needs to be flexible. Our organization needs to be flexible. There are many leaders who read all the books about agile methodology and holacracy and flat hierarchies, and that seems so desirable when you read about it, especially if you came from a bureaucratic, rigid environment before, or from your school or academia. That sounds admirable, and now you want to bring this into your company. But the problem is, it is the same trap of rigidity. Whenever we implement something from the outside, we basically have a solution that seeks a problem. We implement something, we superimpose something that will not fit the realities of the organization. And so what you find, especially in these VUCA environments, in these uncertain environments, is the framework, the model, how the organization needs to restructure often emerges out of the context, and it is often context specific. It is not something that you can prefabricate on a conveyor belt. It's something that has to come out of the context of the situation. I always like to refer to this as a two-way negotiation with reality. You take actions, you take your best hypothesis that's possible based on the context you have. You take decisions, you take actions. You now see outcomes from those actions, and that is now new feedback, which leads to new decisions, which then leads to new actions. It's a constant cycle of interacting with reality, of seeing, of iterating, of trial and error also to some degree, not in the sense of just going wild in an unrestrained manner. Trial and error in the sense of controlled action in which you can already anticipate what certain outcomes can be, including anticipating risks and trade-offs that you have to make. And you can only really do this if you have context. And that's the problem with rigid organization. Context typically doesn't travel really well across human hierarchy. So it happens too often that top management, that leaders, that decision makers are actually blindsided about the real reality of what's going on, not only internally, but also externally. And often that information reaches them way too late. And then, of course, only reactivity and great trade-offs have to be made. Only reactivity is the only choice left. So if you're dealing with fast-moving environments, we need to have a very, very close relationship to reality itself, and to constantly have our sensors on the pulse of what's going on. And it's not just about perceiving reality in a passive way. It's really about interacting with reality in a fast-paced manner, constantly iterating, taking actions, taking decisions, taking actions, testing for outcomes, testing for results, iterating on it on top. And of course, you use your judgment. Sometimes you don't see instant results and outcomes. You use your judgment. Sometimes you understand certain things need longer in order to show results. But the fact is, you figure things out in an explorative manner. And that is a very different operating system from most of traditional business school teachings, from most of what we learn of how a company works. But also those are the companies who then end up doing mass layoffs because they hired people, or they built departments that are simply not fit anymore for the market realities of today. And so if you want to prepare ourselves for constantly changing environments, we need to really reprogram, reconfigure our operating systems and become comfortable with change, become comfortable with a great flexibility in the how, and a constant willingness to challenge the status quo. And the status quo is not just some external reality. The status quo starts with the status quo of our worldview and beliefs. That's the first status quo. That's the first line of defense. And if you're willing to challenge your worldviews and your beliefs about your business, about your market, and you're open to question your assumptions, and also to test for what might be outdated maps of reality, you will find entirely new possibilities in your own context that you couldn't see before. because your mind would just not allow, your mind would just filter them away because they were incongruent with your worldview and your beliefs. And in many of those cases, you don't need an external consultant or advisor to tell you what to do. The moment you change your operating system, it becomes often naturally clear what the most common sense next actions are. And as with anything, it starts with how you see the world, because that creates the world you see. And this cannot be underestimated, especially if you're an organizational leader. And again, I've seen this independent of geographies, of industries, of roles. An organization is driven by the beliefs, by the worldviews of the people who work in that organization, because that determines the structures, the processes, the agreements that people make with each other. And ideally, we are being very flexible about those agreements, about how the org chart looks like, how the process look like, and we adopt an operating system of constant iteration, improvement, and in the context of interacting and negotiating with reality, to test what works and then also build our own structures according to what works, and basically get ahead of any change before we're being forced into reactivity and potential negative consequences. It all starts with our mental operating systems.